In the decadent heights of ancient Rome, where power determines fate and defiance means death, a young healer named Livia dares to reject Emperor Nero's marriage proposal. Her refusal sparks a cruel punishment, being tied to a chariot and dragged through the streets as an example to all who would defy imperial will. But when a enslaved gladiator named Marcus witnesses her torment, he risks everything to save her, setting in motion a tale sacrifice, forbidden love, and the ultimate price of freedom. Their story becomes a testament to the power of human dignity in the face of tyranny, leading to a devastating choice that will echo through eternity. The scorching Roman sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the imperial palace, as Livia pressed her trembling fingers against the herbs in her basket. At 19, she had already earned a reputation throughout Rome as a healer, whose gentle touch could cure ailments that confounded the empire's finest physicians. Her dark hair, braided simply and adorned with a single jasmine flower from her mother's garden, framed a face marked by both kindness and an unwavering strength that she herself didn't fully recognize. "The Emperor waits." The Praetorian guard's voice cut through her thoughts like a blade through silk. Livia had been summoned 3 days ago. The messenger, who arrived at her modest home in the Suburra district, had made it clear this was not a request. Emperor Nero himself required her presence, though the purpose remained mysteriously unspoken. She had assumed it was for her healing skills. Perhaps someone in the imperial household had fallen ill. How naive that assumption would prove to be. The throne room stretched before her like a golden canyon, its pillars reaching toward a painted ceiling depicting the gods in their eternal glory. Nero sat upon his throne, draped in purple silk that did little to hide his corpulent form, his eyes, cold and calculating, fixed upon her the moment she entered. Around him, courtiers whispered behind painted fans, their faces masks of practiced indifference. "Ah, the famous healer of the common people." Nero's voice echoed across the vast chamber. "Come closer, child." Each step forward felt like walking deeper into a trap. Livia's bare feet, she had been forced to remove her sandals at the entrance, made no sound on the cold marble. She stopped at the prescribed distance and bowed, not too deep as to show servility, not too shallow as to show disrespect. It was a balance she had learned from treating nobles who occasionally sought her services in secret. "Your Excellency," she said, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart. Nero rose from his throne with surprising grace for a man of his size. He descended the steps slowly, each movement calculated for maximum dramatic effect. The courtiers fell silent, sensing something momentous was about to unfold. "Do you know why I have summoned you?" he asked, circling her like a lion, stalking prey. "I assumed someone required healing, Your Excellency." His laugh was sharp and unpleasant. "In a way, yes. I require healing from the loneliness that plagues an emperor's heart." The words hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Livia's mind raced, trying to comprehend what she was hearing. Surely he couldn't mean... "I have watched you," Nero continued, his fingers reaching out to touch a strand of her hair. She fought the urge to recoil, moving through the slums, bringing hope to the hopeless. Such compassion, such beauty wasted on the unworthy masses. "I serve all Romans, Your Excellency. Rich and poor alike suffer from illness." How noble! His tone dripped with mockery. "But you shall serve Rome in a different capacity now. You will become my wife." The word wife crashed into Livia like a physical blow. Nero had already had 3 wives: Octavia, whom he had executed; Poppaea, who had died under mysterious circumstances; and Statilia, who lived in constant fear. The fate of Nero's wives was common knowledge, whispered in marketplaces and taverns throughout the empire. "Your Excellency honors me beyond measure," Livia began carefully, her mind searching desperately for a way out. "But I am merely a common healer, unworthy of such an exalted position. Surely there are noble women far more suitable. I have decided." Nero interrupted, his voice hardening. "The wedding will take place at the next full moon. You should be grateful, girl. I am elevating you from the mud of the Subura to the heights of the empire." This was the moment, the crossroads where Livia's life would change forever. Regardless of which path she chose, she could accept and likely die within a year, either from poison, a suspicious accident, or Nero's own violent hand, or she could refuse and face immediate consequences she couldn't even imagine. She thought of her younger brother, Quintus, only 12 years old, who relied on her for everything since their parents had died of plague 3 years ago. She thought of the hundreds of sick and poor who came to her for healing, having nowhere else to turn. She thought of Marcus, the gladiator she had been secretly treating for injuries sustained in the arena, whose gentle eyes and scarred hands had stirred feelings she dared not name. "Your Excellency," she said, raising her head to meet his gaze directly, an act of defiance in itself. "I cannot accept." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the ever-present sound of fans stopped as every courtier held their breath. Nero's face, already flushed from wine, turned a deeper shade of red. "Cannot," he repeated, as if the word was foreign to him. "Cannot. I have taken a sacred vow to Minerva," Livia said, the lie coming to her lips unbidden but necessary. "I am pledged to remain unmarried, dedicated only to the healing arts." To break such a vow would bring the goddess's wrath upon Rome itself. It was a desperate gambit. Romans, even emperors, feared the wrath of the gods. But Nero was not just any Roman. His ego had grown so massive that he considered himself a god incarnate. "You dare refuse me?" His voice rose to a roar that echoed off the walls. "You dare claim the gods stand between you and your emperor? They claim only that I must honor my vows, Your Excellency. Surely Rome's glory rests upon maintaining the favor of the gods." The slap came without warning, sending Livia sprawling onto the marble floor. Her cheek burned, and she tasted blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her mouth. Gasps arose from the assembled courtiers, though whether from shock or excitement, she couldn't tell. "Guards," Nero bellowed, "take this ungrateful wretch to the dungeons. Let her contemplate the price of defying Caesar." Strong hands grabbed Livia's arms, hauling her to her feet. As they dragged her from the throne room, she caught sight of Senator Cassius, one of the few remaining men of honor in Nero's court. His face was grim, his jaw clenched in barely suppressed rage. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and she saw in them a promise: he would not let this injustice stand unopposed. The dungeons beneath the palace were a world apart from the golden splendor above. The air was thick with the stench of human misery, and the only light came from scattered torches that cast dancing shadows on the damp walls. They threw her into a cell barely large enough to lie down in, the iron door clanging shut with a finality that made her heart sink. "Enjoy your accommodations," one guard sneered. "Tomorrow the emperor will announce your special punishment." "Something memorable," he said. "Something that will ensure no one ever refuses him again." As their footsteps faded, Livia sank to the floor, her back against the cold stone wall. Tears came then, not for herself, but for Quintus, who would wake tomorrow to find his sister gone; for her patients, who would suffer without treatment; for Marcus, who would wonder why she never came to tend his wounds after tomorrow's games. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, a small flame of defiance flickered in her chest. She had stood before the most powerful man in the world and said no. Whatever came next, she had kept her dignity, her integrity, her soul. That had to count for something. As night fell and the dungeon grew even colder, Livia whispered prayers to any god who might listen. Not for rescue, she knew better than to expect divine intervention, but for strength. Strength to face whatever tomorrow would bring. Strength to die if necessary, with the same courage she had shown in the throne room. She didn't know that at that very moment, in the gladiator barracks across the city, Marcus was sharpening his sword for tomorrow's games. Unaware that the woman who had shown him kindness in a world of brutality was about to need a champion. She didn't know that Senator Cassius was meeting in secret with other dissatisfied nobles, using her plight as a rallying cry against Nero's tyranny. She didn't know that her single act of defiance had already begun rippling outward, touching lives and changing fates in ways she could never imagine. All she knew was that tomorrow would bring judgment, and whatever form that judgment took, she would meet it standing tall, unbroken, unbowed. The night passed slowly, each hour marked by the changing of the guards and the distant screams of other prisoners. Livia dozed fitfully, her dreams filled with images of chariots and chains, of Nero's cruel laughter and her brother's tears. When dawn finally came, seeping through the tiny barred window high in her cell, she was almost grateful. The waiting was over. The guards came for her. As the sun reached its apex, the heat of the day already oppressive, even in the depths of the dungeon. They bound her hands but said nothing of her fate. As they led her through the winding corridors and up into the light, Livia steeled herself for whatever was to come. But nothing could have prepared her for the sight that greeted her in the palace courtyard. The palace courtyard had been transformed into a theater of cruelty. Hundreds of Roman citizens, from patricians in their finest togas to plebeians in rough-spun tunics, had been summoned to witness what Nero proclaimed would be a lesson in imperial justice. The stones of the courtyard, usually pristine white, seemed to radiate malevolent heat under the afternoon sun. At the center of it all stood a chariot, but not just any chariot. This was a war chariot, its wheels reinforced with iron, its body painted blood red. Two black horses, chosen for their strength and temperament, stamped nervously, sensing the dark energy that permeated the air. Livia stood between two guards, her wrists still bound, her simple healer's dress torn from rough handling. Despite everything, she held her head high, her dark eyes scanning the crowd. She saw faces she recognized, merchants she had treated for fever, mothers whose children she had saved from illness, old soldiers whose war wounds she had eased. Some looked away in shame at their powerlessness. Others met her gaze with tears streaming down their faces. Citizens of Rome. Nero's voice boomed from his elevated platform, shaded by purple silk canopies, while the crowd sweltered in the sun. You are gathered here to witness what happens to those who dare refuse the generous affections of their emperor. He paused for effect, his bloated face gleaming with sweat and anticipation. Beside him sat his current wife, Statilia, her face a carefully composed mask that betrayed nothing of her thoughts. But Livia caught the slight trembling of her hands, the only sign of the terror she must feel watching her husband orchestrate such cruelty. This common girl, this nobody from the slums, was offered the highest honor any woman could receive, to become wife to a god. And she refused. Nero's voice rose to a theatrical pitch. She claimed the gods themselves stood against our union. Such blasphemy, such arrogance. A murmur ran through the crowd. Many knew Livia, knew her kindness, her selflessness. The cognitive dissonance of seeing their healer, their angel of mercy, being condemned as a blasphemer was palpable. Therefore, Nero continued, clearly relishing every word, she will be given a chance to prove her divine protection. She will be tied to this chariot and dragged through the streets of Rome. If the gods truly favor her, surely they will intervene. If not, her broken body will serve as a reminder to all that Caesar's will is absolute. The guards moved toward Livia, rope in hand. This was the moment. She could beg, could recant, could throw herself on Nero's mercy. But as she looked at the crowd, at the faces of people she had spent her life serving, she knew she couldn't. If she broke now, something essential in the spirit of Rome would break with her. I need no divine intervention, she called out, her voice carrying across the courtyard with surprising strength. I am a Roman citizen, and I claim the dignity that is my birthright. You may break my body, Nero, but you will never break my spirit. The crowd gasped. To address the emperor by name alone without title was unthinkable. But Livia was beyond caring about protocol. If these were to be her last words, let them be remembered. Nero's face purpled with rage. "Tie her now, and ensure the ropes are extra tight. Let her feel every stone, every turn." As the guards approached, a commotion erupted from the eastern gate of the courtyard. The crowd parted like water before a ship's prow, and through the gap strode a figure that made even the guards pause. Marcus the Gladiator stood 6 feet tall, his body a map of scars that told the story of 100 battles survived. His shoulders, broad as an ox yoke, were bare save for the light armor of a retiarius. His face, weathered by sun and hardship, was set in an expression of deadly determination. But it was his eyes that drew attention. Grey as a winter storm, they held a depth of feeling that seemed impossible for one who killed for sport. He had not been summoned to this spectacle. He should have been in the barracks, preparing for the afternoon games. But news of Livia's fate had reached him through the network of slaves and servants that formed the invisible backbone of Rome. The woman who had tended his wounds without payment, who had treated him not as property but as a human being, who had shown him kindness when the world offered only brutality, she was in mortal danger. Marcus had made his choice the moment he heard. Whatever the consequences, he would not let her face this alone. "Who dares interrupt Caesar's justice?" Nero demanded, though there was a slight quaver in his voice. Even emperors knew to be wary of gladiators who moved with such purposeful violence. Marcus dropped to one knee, a gesture of respect that somehow managed to convey no submission whatsoever. "I am Marcus, champion of the Ludus Magnus. I invoke the ancient right of intervention." Another gasp from the crowd. The right of intervention was an old law rarely invoked, that allowed a gladiator who had won more than 50 matches to challenge any punishment deemed unjust. It was a relic from the Republic, one that emperors had been trying to abolish for decades, but never quite managed due to the popularity of the games. "You dare invoke that archaic nonsense?" Nero sputtered. "I invoke it in the name of Mars, god of war, whose servant I am," Marcus replied, his voice steady as granite. "This woman saved my life after the battle with the Thracian twins. By gladiatorial code, her life is mine to protect." This was partially true. Livia had indeed treated him after that particularly brutal match, but gladiatorial code said nothing about life debts to healers. Marcus was improvising, betting on Nero's ignorance of the finer points of arena law. Senator Cassius, who had been watching from the crowd, saw his opportunity. "The law is clear, Your Excellency," he called out, stepping forward. "The right of intervention must be honored, or risk the wrath of Mars and the displeasure of the people who worship him through the games." Nero's eyes darted between Marcus Cassius and the crowd, which was beginning to murmur with excitement. Romans loved nothing more than unexpected drama, and this was better than any theatrical performance. "Fine," Nero spat, "but if you invoke intervention, Gladiator, you must take her punishment upon yourself. You will be tied to the chariot in her place." "No." Livia's cry rang out before Marcus could respond. "Marcus, don't do this. You don't owe me anything." For the first time since entering the courtyard, Marcus looked directly at her. Their eyes met, and in that gaze was everything that had gone unspoken during those quiet moments in the healing chambers. The growing affection, the impossible hope, the recognition of kindred spirits in a world that seemed designed to crush spirits entirely. "With respect, my lady," Marcus said, a sad smile playing at the corners of his mouth, "that is where you are wrong." He stood and began removing his armor, letting it fall to the ground with deliberate slowness. The crowd watched, in fascinated horror, as each piece revealed more of his scarred flesh, wounds from swords, tridents, lions, and a dozen other implements of death. Yet he moved with grace, almost with dignity, as if this moment was not a humiliation, but an honor. "Wait," Nero said, a cruel smile spreading across his face as a new idea formed. "I have a better proposition. You want to save this ungrateful wretch? You want to play hero? Then let us make it interesting." He stood, his purple robes billowing around him like a toxic cloud. "Both of you will be tied to the chariot. But here's my mercy. If you both survive 3 complete circuits of the Circus Maximus, you will both go free, completely free." The gladiator, will be released from bondage, and the girl will be pardoned of all crimes against the state." The crowd erupted in shocked exclamations. The Circus Maximus was nearly a mile in circumference. 3 circuits while being dragged would be almost certainly fatal for one person, let alone 2. However, Nero continued, raising his hand for silence, "If either of you begs for mercy, if either of you renounces your defiance, the other dies immediately. Those are my terms." Marcus and Livia looked at each other across the courtyard. It was a devil's bargain, designed to torture them psychologically as well as physically. Each would have to endure not only their own pain, but the knowledge that crying out would doom the other. "I accept," they said in unison, their voices harmonizing in a way that sent chills through the crowd. "Excellent." Nero clapped his hands like a delighted child. "Prepare them." The guards moved forward, and this time neither Marcus nor Livia resisted. They were bound side by side to the back of the chariot, their arms stretched forward and tied to the vehicle's frame, their bodies positioned so they would be dragged on their backs, able to see the sky but not the ground rushing beneath them. As the guards worked, Marcus managed to turn his head slightly toward Livia. "Why did you refuse him?" he asked quietly. "Because saying yes would have been a different kind of death," she replied. "A death of the soul. Why did you intervene?" "Because watching you die while I did nothing would have been my death of the soul." The chariot driver, a veteran of the circus named Titus, looked back at them with obvious reluctance. He had been ordered to maintain a steady pace, not so fast as to kill them immediately. Where would be the entertainment in that? But fast enough to ensure maximum suffering. "I'm sorry," he whispered to them, genuine anguish in his voice. "Do your duty," Marcus replied. "We chose this." As the horses were whipped into motion and the chariot lurched forward, Livia felt the first bite of stone against her back. The pain was immediate and shocking, even though they were still moving slowly through the courtyard toward the street. The crowd followed, a grotesque parade of morbid curiosity and genuine grief. Some threw flowers in their path, a sign of respect for the condemned. Others called out prayers to various gods. Still others simply watched in stunned silence as 2 of Rome's bravest souls were subjected to torture that would have broken most people before it even began. The first turn onto the main street nearly ended everything. The chariot swung wide, and both Marcus and Livia were slammed against a wall. The crowd screamed, some in horror, some in excitement. Blood already marked their path, a red trail that would only grow longer. "Look at me," Marcus gasped through gritted teeth. "Don't look at the crowd, don't look at the sky. Look at me." Livia turned her head, meeting his storm-gray eyes. In them, she found an anchor point, something to focus on besides the agony that was already threatening to overwhelm her. "Tell me about your brother," Marcus said, his voice strained but determined to give her something else to think about. "Quintus," she managed. "He wants to be a scholar. He's brilliant, reads everything he can find. He sounds like he takes after his sister." Despite everything, Livia almost smiled. "He's nothing like me. He's cautious, thoughtful. He would never have refused the emperor. Then he would never have earned what you've earned." "What's that? A death sentence?" "The respect of every decent person in Rome." The chariot hit a particularly rough section of road, and both of them cried out involuntarily. But neither begged for mercy, neither spoke the words that would end the other's life. As they approached the Circus Maximus for the first circuit, the crowd had swelled to thousands. Word had spread through Rome like wildfire, a gladiator and a healer, defying Nero, enduring the impossible for each other. It was the kind of story that would become legend, regardless of how it ended. But for Marcus and Livia, dragged behind the chariot with their blood painting the streets of Rome, there was no thought of legend or history. There was only pain, will, and the determination not to be the one who broke first. The first circuit of the Circus Maximus loomed before them like the gates of Hades itself. The entrance to the Circus Maximus was marked by towering statues of Neptune and Mars, their marble eyes gazing down impassively at the spectacle below. The great racing arena, capable of holding 250,000 spectators, was not filled for races today, But word of Nero's cruel punishment had drawn thousands who lined the track's perimeter. As the chariot entered the circus, the sound changed. The wheels, which had clattered on stone streets, now ground against the packed sand of the racing track. For Marcus and Livia, this meant a different kind of agony. Instead of sharp stones, they were now being scraped raw by countless grains of sand, each one a tiny knife against their already bloodied backs. "First circuit begin," shouted the imperial herald, his voice carrying across the vast space. Titus, the chariot driver, kept the horses at a steady trot. His hands trembled on the reins. In his 20 years of racing, he had seen horses die, charioteers crushed, spectacular crashes that left men crippled for life. But this deliberate, slow torture of two people whose only crime was defying a mad emperor, this was something that would haunt him forever. Marcus forced himself to keep talking, knowing that silence would mean surrendering to the pain. "Livia, tell me about the first person you ever healed." She struggled to focus through the fire spreading across her back. My mother. She had a fever when I was 7. The physicians said she would die. I stayed with her for 3 days, cooling her with wet cloths, making her drink willow bark tea. She lived. You were 7? Marcus's voice held wonder despite his agony. I knew then what I was meant to do. To heal, to help. It's all I've ever wanted. The chariot hit a raised section of track, and both of them were lifted and slammed back down. The crowd winced collectively. Some began to weep openly. A group of women in the stands started praying loudly to Minerva, goddess of wisdom and healing. Among the watchers stood several figures of note. Senator Cassius was there, his face a mask of controlled fury as he memorized every detail for the speech he would give in the Senate tomorrow. Beside him stood Julia, Livia's closest friend, who had to be physically restrained from running onto the truck. But perhaps the most significant observer was someone few noticed, a young boy of 12 who had slipped away from his guardian and made his way to the circus. Quintus, Livia's brother, watched with eyes that had aged a decade in a single hour. He did not cry, he did not call out, he simply watched, burning every moment into his memory, knowing that regardless of the outcome, his life's purpose had just crystallized before him. Your turn, Livia gasped to Marcus. Tell me about your freedom dreams. Marcus almost laughed, though it came out as more of a choked sob. I dream of a small farm. Nothing grand, just enough land for grain and a vegetable garden. Maybe some olive trees, a place where the only fighting is against weeds and weather. That sounds peaceful. I've had enough violence for 10 lifetimes. I want to create things, not destroy them. I want to wake up and know that nothing I do that day will end in death. They were a quarter through the first circuit now. Their blood had mixed with the sand, creating a dark trail that marked their passage. Some in the crowd began following alongside the track, keeping pace with the chariot. Murderer! Someone shouted at Nero's pavilion, which had been erected at the finish line. This is murder! The Praetorian Guard moved to arrest the speaker, but found themselves facing a wall of citizens who closed ranks around the man. The guards hesitated. These weren't slaves or criminals. These were Roman citizens, merchants, artisans, even some minor nobles. Arresting them all would cause a riot. Nero, reclining on his purple cushions, seemed oblivious to the growing tension. He was enjoying himself immensely, occasionally commenting to his courtiers about the poetic justice of the scene. Meanwhile, in the Gladiator barracks across the city, word had reached the other fighters about Marcus's intervention. These men who knew nothing but violence and survival were not given to sentiment. But Marcus was respected, even loved, among them. He had never lauded his victories over the less successful fighters. He had shared his winnings with injured gladiators who couldn't fight. He had treated them as brothers, not competitors. We should go, growled Titus the Thracian, a giant of a man who had fought beside Marcus many times. And do what? Asked Septimus, an older gladiator. Storm the circus. We'd be cut down before we reached the gates. Then we do nothing. We bear witness, Septimus said gravely. And we remember. The arena has a long memory, and Nero has made an enemy of it today. Back at the circus, the chariot was approaching the halfway point of the first circuit. Livia's dress was now more red than white, and Marcus's back looked like it had been flayed. Yet still neither begged for mercy. "Marcus," Livia whispered, her voice growing weaker. "If I don't, you will," he interrupted fiercely. "We both will. Don't you dare give up on me now." "I'm not giving up. I want you to know, these weeks, treating your wounds, talking with you, they were the happiest I've known since my parents died. Don't talk like that. Don't talk like this is goodbye." But even as he said it, Marcus could feel his strength ebbing. The human body could only endure so much, and they weren't even through the first circuit. 3 circuits seemed impossible, a goal as distant as the stars. It was then that something unexpected happened. An old woman, bent with age and dressed in rags, suddenly hobbled onto the track ahead of the chariot. The crowd gasped. Titus pulled hard on the reins, bringing the horses to a stop, just feet from her. "What is the meaning of this?" Nero roared from his pavilion. The old woman raised her head, and those close enough to see her face stepped back in shock. Her eyes were completely white, the mark of a seer, one touched by the gods. "I am Pythia," she announced, her voice carrying with unnatural clarity, "and I bring a message from the gods themselves." Even Nero fell silent. To interrupt a genuine oracle was to invite divine catastrophe. "The blood of the innocent has touched sacred ground," Pythia intoned. "The gods watch, and they are displeased. He who spills righteous blood for sport and spectacle shall find his own blood spilled before the moon turns full again." She turned her blind eyes toward Nero's pavilion. "Beware, false god. True divinity recognizes its own, and these two bear marks of divine favor. The healer, who serves Minerva, the warrior who honors Mars. Harm them further, and Rome itself shall burn with heaven's wrath." The crowd was deathly silent. Some fell to their knees, others made protective gestures against evil. Even the Praetorian Guard seemed frozen. Nero, however, was not one to be cowed by prophecy. "Seize that old hag," he commanded. But when the guards moved forward, Pythia raised her gnarled staff and struck it against the ground. The sound it made was impossibly loud, like thunder in a clear sky. The horses reared in terror, and several guards stumbled backward. "Choose quickly, Nero," Pythia said. "Release them and show mercy, or continue and seal your doom. The gods have spoken. I am merely their vessel." With that, she walked off the track and disappeared into the crowd, which parted for her like she was diseased. Despite Nero's furious commands, she could not be found. The interruption had given Marcus and Livia a precious respite. They lay gasping, their bodies screaming in agony, but their spirits momentarily lifted by this unexpected intervention. "Was she real?" Livia whispered. "Does it matter?" Marcus replied. "Real or not, she's given the crowd something to think about." Indeed, the atmosphere in the circus had changed. Where before there had been horrified fascination, no, there was something more dangerous, religious fear mixed with righteous anger. Romans took their omens seriously, and an oracle pronouncing doom on the emperor was not something easily dismissed. "Continue," Nero shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "I said continue." Titus looked back at Marcus and Livia, anguish written across his weathered face. "I'm sorry," he said again, and whipped the horses back into motion. The rest of the first circuit was a blur of pain and determination. Marcus and Livia had stopped trying to talk, needing every ounce of energy just to endure. The crowd had grown quieter, more sullen. Some had begun to leave, unable to watch anymore. Others had started gathering stones, though for what purpose wasn't yet clear. As they completed the first circuit and began the second, both Marcus and Livia knew they were approaching their limits. The human body could only lose so much blood, endure so much trauma. They were leaving pieces of themselves on the track, literally and figuratively. "Look at them," someone in the crowd shouted. "Look at what our emperor does for entertainment." "Shame," another voice called out. "Shame on Rome." The cries began to multiply, growing from individual voices to a chorus of dissent. "Shame, shame, shame." Nero stood up, his face purple with rage. "Silence. I command silence." But the crowd was beyond his control now. Years of resentment against his excesses, his cruelties, his mad pretensions to godhood, were bubbling to the surface. The sight of Marcus and Livia, bloody and broken, but undefeated, had become a symbol of everything wrong with Nero's Rome. Senator Cassius saw his moment. He stepped forward, his senatorial toga marking him as a man of authority. "Citizens of Rome," he called out, "is this the Rome our ancestors built? Is this the justice our laws promise?" The crowd roared its response, "No." "Then let us show the emperor what Romans think of such justice." What happened next would be debated by historians for centuries. Some say it was planned, a coordinated rebellion that used this moment as its spark. Others maintain it was spontaneous, the natural explosion of a people pushed too far. The stones that had been gathered began to fly, but not at Marcus and Livia. They flew toward Nero's pavilion. The Praetorian Guard immediately formed a protective wall around the emperor, their shields raised against the projectiles, but there were thousands in the crowd, and only dozens of guards. "Stop the chariot," people began shouting. "Free them! Free them!" Some of the braver souls actually jumped onto the track, running toward the chariot. Titus, seeing them coming and secretly relieved, pulled the horses to a stop. "Don't touch them yet," a voice commanded. It was a physician, one of the city's most respected. "Moving them wrong could kill them. Let me through." The physician, accompanied by several assistants, quickly but carefully began to cut the ropes binding Marcus and Livia to the chariot. When they were free, the crowd let out a cheer that shook the very foundations of the circus. But Marcus and Livia were barely conscious, their bodies a ruin of torn flesh and exposed muscle. They were alive, but only just. "To the temple of Asclepius," the physician commanded. "Quickly, they need immediate treatment or they'll die anyway." As they were carefully lifted onto stretchers, Livia's eyes fluttered open. She found Marcus's face, his own eyes struggling to focus. We didn't break," she whispered. "No," he managed to reply. "We didn't break." But as they were carried from the circus, neither knew if surviving their ordeal would matter. Nero was screaming for order, for arrests, for executions. The crowd was on the verge of full riot. Rome itself seemed to teeter on the edge of chaos. And in his pavilion, surrounded by his guards, Nero's eyes burned with a fury that promised this was far from over. If he couldn't have Livia as his wife, if he couldn't break Marcus's spirit, then he would find other ways to destroy them. The Second Circuit had never been completed, but in a way something more significant had. The people of Rome had said enough. Whether that would save Marcus and Livia, or doom them to an even worse fate, remained to be seen. The temple of Asclepius stood on the Tiber Island, its white marble columns gleaming in the fading light of dusk. It was here that Rome's sick and injured came seeking divine healing, and it was here that Marcus and Livia were brought. More dead than alive, their bodies bearing testament to Nero's cruelty. The high priest, Gaius Antonius, had cleared the temple's main healing chamber for them. It was an unprecedented honor, but these were unprecedented times. Word of what had happened at the Circus Maximus had spread through Rome like wildfire. Already offerings were being let at the temple's entrance, flowers for Livia, small wooden swords for Marcus, and countless prayers written on strips of papyrus. "Will they survive?" Senator Cassius asked, quietly, standing at the doorway as physicians worked frantically over the two still forms. Gaius Antonius, his white robes now stained with blood, shook his head slowly. "Their bodies," I have never seen such damage on living people. The girl has lost so much blood that her heart barely beats. The gladiator's back is flayed to the bone in places. If they survive the night, it will be a miracle. Then we pray for miracles, Cassius replied. But even as the physicians worked, Nero was not idle. In his palace, he raged like a wounded beast, destroying priceless artifacts, striking servants, screaming threats at anyone within earshot. Rebellion, he shrieked at his advisors. Open rebellion. In my own circus, Your Excellency, ventured Tigellinus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard. Perhaps it would be wise to let this matter rest. The people are agitated. Pushing further could what? Nero rounded on him, spittle flying from his lips. Could cause them to throw more stones, could make them shout more insults. They have already done their worst. With respect, Caesar, they have not done their worst. Today they threw stones. Tomorrow they might throw spears. Nero's eyes narrowed dangerously. Are you suggesting I should fear the mob? I am suggesting, Divine One, that sometimes the wisest course is strategic withdrawal. Let the gladiator and the girl die of their wounds. The crowd will mourn, then forget, as they always do. But Nero was beyond such reasoning. In his mind he had been humiliated, defied not once but twice. First by Livia's refusal, then by the crowd's intervention. Such insults could not go unpunished. Send word to the temple, he commanded. If they survive, they are to be brought back to the palace. I'm not finished with them yet. Meanwhile, in the temple of Asclepius, a different drama was unfolding. Quintus, Livia's young brother, had fought his way through the crowds to reach his sister's side. The priests had tried to stop him, but the boy's desperation was so evident that Gaius Antonius himself had intervened. Let him in, the high priest had said. Perhaps his presence will anchor her soul to this world. Quintus knelt beside his sister's bed, taking her hand in both of his. It was cold, so cold, and her breathing was barely visible. Livia, he whispered, tears streaming down his young face. Please don't leave me. You're all I have. Please. On the adjacent bed, Marcus stirred slightly. Despite his own agony, he turned his head toward the boy's voice. You're Quintus? He managed to rasp. The boy looked up, startled. You know me? She talked about you. Constantly, said you were the smart one. Despite everything, Quintus almost smiled. She said that? Said you would change the world someday. With your words, your ideas. Marcus coughed, tasting blood. She was so proud. Don't talk, one of the physicians warned Marcus. You need to save your strength. But Marcus ignored him, focusing on the boy. Listen to me, Quintus. Whatever happens, your sister is the bravest person in Rome. She stood up to a tyrant. She showed us all what courage looks like. But what use is courage if she dies? Quintus asked bitterly. Courage isn't about living or dying, Marcus replied, his voice growing weaker. It's about choosing what's worth living or dying for. She chose. We both did. As night fell fully, the temple became a vigil site. Hundreds of Romans gathered outside, holding torches, singing hymns to Asclepius, praying for the two who had become symbols of resistance against tyranny. Among the crowd was Julia, Livia's friend, who had organized the women of the Sabara to maintain a constant prayer circle. There was Titus the Thracian and other gladiators from Marcus's Ludus, standing guard unofficially, ready to fight anyone who might try to harm their brother-in-arms. There were senators who opposed Nero, merchants who had been taxed into near poverty, soldiers who remembered when Rome stood for something noble. Inside the temple, the night wore on with agonizing slowness. Several times Livia's breathing stopped, only to resume after heart-stopping moments. Marcus developed a fever that had him thrashing and calling out in languages none recognized, remnants of his childhood before slavery, perhaps. It was during the darkest hour, just before dawn, that something extraordinary happened. Livia's eyes opened, clear and focused, despite her ordeal. She saw Quintus first, his head resting on the edge of her bed, exhausted from his vigil. "Brother," she whispered. Quintus jerked awake. "Livia, you're awake?" "Marcus?" she asked immediately. "He's here. He's alive." With enormous effort, Livia turned her head. Marcus was indeed there, unconscious but breathing. His back was covered in bandages, soaked through with blood and healing oils. Even in unconsciousness, his face was creased with pain. "He saved me," she said softly. "You saved each other," Gaius Antonius said, approaching with visible relief. "Your survival is nothing short of miraculous. The gods have surely blessed you both, or cursed us," Livia replied with bitter humor. "Nero won't let this stand. Let us worry about Nero," the high priest said. "For now you must focus on healing." But even as he spoke, the sound of marching feet echoed from outside. The Praetorian Guard had arrived, a full century of them, their armor gleaming in the torchlight. By order of the divine emperor, their captain announced, "The criminals Marcus and Livia are to be returned to imperial custody immediately." The crowd erupted in angry shouts, but the guards were ready this time, shields locked, spears pointed outward. Any resistance would result in massacre. Gaius Antonius stepped forward, his priestly robes giving him some authority, even over imperial guards. "These two are under the protection of Asclepius. To remove them from sacred ground while they are still gravely injured would be sacrilege. The emperor's orders supersede religious protection," the captain replied, though he looked uncomfortable. Many of the guards were religious men, and violating temple sanctuary was not something done lightly. "Then give us 3 days, Cassius called out, pushing through the crowd. 3 days for them to heal enough to survive transport. Surely the emperor can wait that long for his justice." The captain hesitated. He had been ordered to bring them back, but not specifically when, and if they died in transport, Nero would likely blame him. 3 days, he agreed finally. "But the temple will be surrounded. No one enters or leaves without our permission." As the immediate crisis passed, those inside the temple began to plan. 3 days wasn't much time, but it was something. "We could try to smuggle them out," Julia suggested. "Through 100 guards," Cassius shook his head. "Impossible. Then we fight," Titus the Thracian growled. "And give Nero excuse to slaughter everyone here," the senator replied. "No, we need something else, something unexpected." It was Marcus who provided the answer. As the second day dawned, he had recovered enough to speak at length, though every word clearly pained him. "The emperor wants a spectacle," he said. Propped up carefully on pillows, he was denied his full show at the circus. "Give him a different one." "What do you mean?" Cassius asked. "A trial by combat. It's an ancient rite, older even than the Republic. If someone facing execution can find a champion to fight for them, they can claim trial by combat. If their champion wins, they go free." "But you can barely stand," Livia protested from her own bed. "You couldn't fight anyone right now." "Not me," Marcus said, looking at Titus. "Him, or any of my brothers who would stand for us." Titus straightened, his massive frame filling the doorway. "It would be an honor. But who would Nero choose as his champion?" Julia asked. Marcus's expression darkened. "Knowing Nero? He'll choose Britannicus." Everyone fell silent. Britannicus the Destroyer was the most feared gladiator in Rome. He had never lost a match in 10 years of fighting. He was said to have killed over 100 men in the arena. More importantly, he was completely loyal to Nero, who had elevated him from slavery to citizenship as a reward for his brutality. "That's suicide," Cassius said flatly. "Maybe," Marcus agreed, "but it's a chance. And more importantly, it's public. Nero loves the games above all else. He won't be able to resist the opportunity to see us destroyed in his favorite venue." "You're gambling with Titus's life," Livia said. "No," Titus interrupted. "Marcus is giving me the chance to do what gladiators do, Fight for something that matters, not for the crowd's amusement but for justice, for honor, for family. He looked at Marcus. You are my brother. I will stand for you. On the second night, as this plan was being refined, an unexpected visitor arrived. Statilia, Nero's current wife, came to the temple disguised as a common mourner. The guards, not expecting the empress herself, let her pass without inspection. She found her way to Livia's bedside and lowered her hood. Livia gasped in recognition. Your Majesty, shiz, Statilia said softly. I'm not here. You haven't seen me. But I had to come. I had to tell you what you did. Refusing him, you did what I never had the courage to do. You're his wife. You had no choice. Statilia's laugh was bitter. There's always a choice. We just tell ourselves there isn't because the alternative is too frightening. You chose fear over dishonor. I chose dishonor over fear, and I've regretted it every day since. She pulled out a small vial from her robes. This is extract of phoenix tears. Not really from a phoenix, of course, but a rare medicine from the East. It accelerates healing dramatically. It's what Nero uses when he injures himself in his theatrical performances. Why would you help us? Because someone needs to stand up to him. And since I'm too much a coward to do it myself, the least I can do is help those brave enough to try. She pressed the vial into Livia's hand. Use half for yourself, half for your gladiator. You'll need your strength for what's coming. As quickly as she had come, Statilia disappeared back into the night, leaving Livia wondering if she had dreamed the encounter. But the vial was real, and when she and Marcus drank its contents, they felt strength returning to their ravaged bodies. Not completely, but enough to give them hope. On the morning of the third day, the captain of the Praetorian Guard returned. Time's up. The emperor waits. Marcus and Livia were helped to their feet. They could stand, barely, and walk with assistance. The crowd outside had grown even larger, and as they emerged from the temple, a great cry went up. We go to the palace, Marcus announced loudly enough for all to hear, and there we claim the ancient right of trial by combat. The captain looked surprised but couldn't deny the legality of the claim. As they were loaded onto a cart for transport, surrounded by guards, the crowd began to follow. By the time they reached the palace, it seemed half of Rome was marching with them. Nero received them in his throne room, the same place where this had all begun. But something had changed. The courtiers seemed nervous, casting glances between the emperor and the accused. The sound of the crowd outside could be heard, even through the thick walls. So, Nero said, his voice dripping with venom, the lovers return. Tell me, was your little display at the circus worth it? Was your defiance worth the pain? Yes, Livia and Marcus said in unison, their voices carrying clearly through the hall. Nero's face darkened. You will beg before this is over. You will crawl and plead for the mercy you spurned. Actually, Marcus said, stepping forward despite his injuries, we claim trial by combat. The throne room went absolutely silent. Even Nero seemed momentarily stunned. Trial by combat, he repeated, then began to laugh. Oh, this is perfect. You can barely stand, Gladiator. Who will be your champion? I will, Titus the Thracian announced, entering the throne room. He had somehow gotten past the guards, or perhaps they had let him pass, knowing the ancient laws protected a champion's right to answer such a call. Nero's grin widened. Excellent. And you know who my champion will be, don't you? Britannicus, Titus said simply. Indeed, tomorrow, at noon, in the Colosseum. To the death, of course. And when your champion falls, as he surely will, you two will face a punishment that will make the Chariot seem like mercy. But, as Nero spoke, making his grand pronouncements, he failed to notice the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The guards stood a little less firmly. The courtiers whispered a little more freely. The crowd outside grew a little louder. The spark that Livia had lit with her refusal, that Marcus had fanned with his sacrifice, was growing into something larger. Rome was remembering what it meant to stand against tyranny. Tomorrow's combat would be more than just a fight between two gladiators. It would be a battle for the soul of Rome itself. The Colosseum had never seen such a crowd. Every seat was filled, from the patrician boxes to the wooden benches where the plebeians sat. People hung from the arches, climbed the statues, and pressed against every barrier. This was not merely a gladiatorial match. It had become a referendum on Nero's rule itself. In the chambers beneath the arena, Titus the Thracian prepared for battle. His massive hands, scarred from 1,000 fights, methodically checked each piece of armor. Marcus sat beside him, still weak but insistent on being present. "Remember," Marcus said, "Britannicus always favors his right side when he strikes. He had an injury there years ago that never fully healed. He hides it well, but in prolonged combat it shows." Titus finished. "You've told me 3 times, brother. I'm sorry, you want to be the one fighting." "I know." Titus placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "But the gods chose this path. Your fight was on the streets behind that chariot. Mine is here, in the sand." In another chamber, Livia sat with Julia and Quintus. She had refused to stay at the temple, insisting on witnessing whatever was to come. The Phoenix tear medicine had worked miraculously, but she was still fragile, her body a map of barely healed wounds. "You don't have to watch this," Julia said softly. "Yes, I do. Titus fights because of us. The least we can do is bear witness." Above them, in the imperial box, Nero lounged on his golden throne, dressed in purple silk that made him look like an overripe plum. Beside him sat Statilia, her face a careful mask that betrayed nothing of her secret aid to the condemned. "Citizens of Rome," Nero called out, his voice amplified by the acoustic design of the arena. "Today you witness justice. The gladiator Marcus and the healer Livia have defied your emperor. They have sown sedition and chaos. Now let the gods themselves judge their fate through mortal combat." The crowd's response was not the usual bloodthirsty roar. Instead, there was a low murmur, like the sea before a storm. Many wore white ribbons, a symbol of support for Livia. Others carried small wooden swords, tokens of solidarity with Marcus. Entering from the Gate of Life, the arena announcer called, "Fighting for the accused, Titus of Thrace, victor of 47 matches." Titus emerged into the blazing sunlight, his armor gleaming. He was massive, 6.5 feet of muscle and scars, carrying a gladius and shield. But what struck observers most was his calm. Where gladiators usually played to the crowd, roaring and posturing, Titus simply walked to his position and waited. And from the Gate of Death, fighting for imperial justice, Britannicus the Destroyer, undefeated in 103 matches. The crowd fell silent as Britannicus appeared. He was not as large as Titus, but there was something terrifying in his economy of movement, the way he seemed to glide rather than walk. His armor was black, polished to a mirror sheen, and he carried a trident and net, the weapons of a retiarius, requiring skill and speed rather than brute strength. "Let justice be done," Nero shouted, and the match began. Britannicus moved first, his net whirling in a hypnotic pattern. Titus raised his shield, advancing steadily but cautiously. They circled each other, each seeking an opening, measuring the other's rhythm. The first exchange was lightning fast. Britannicus cast his net, but Titus had anticipated it, dropping to one knee and raising his shield at an angle that sent the net sliding harmlessly away. He lunged forward with his gladius, but Britannicus was already dancing backward, his trident keeping Titus at bay. "He's faster than I expected," Julia whispered, watching Britannicus move. "But Titus is patient," Quintus observed, with wisdom beyond his years. "Look how he's controlling the center of the arena." Indeed, while Britannicus circled and darted, Titus maintained his position, forcing his opponent to do all the moving. Under the harsh sun, in heavy armor, such constant motion would be exhausting. The second exchange was more violent. Britannicus feinted with the net, then thrust with his trident. One prong caught Titus's shoulder, drawing first blood. The crowd gasped, but Titus didn't even flinch. He grabbed the trident's shaft with his free hand, yanking Britannicus forward and slamming his shield into the man's face. Britannicus staggered back, blood streaming from his nose. For the first time in years, he had been truly hurt in the arena. His eyes, visible through his helmet's visor, blazed with fury. What followed was combat at its most brutal and beautiful. The two gladiators moved in a deadly dance. Attack and counterattack, thrust and parry. Britannicus's speed against Titus's strength. The net against the shield, the trident against the sword. In the imperial box, Nero leaned forward, his earlier confidence wavering. Britannicus should have won by now. The destroyer never let fights drag on this long. Your champion seems to be struggling, my lord, Senator Cassius observed, having secured a seat near the emperor to better witness events. Silence, Nero snapped. Britannicus is merely toying with the Thracian, but it was becoming clear that Britannicus was not toying with anyone. As the fight passed the 10-minute mark, an eternity in gladiatorial combat, both men were showing signs of exhaustion, and it was here that Marcus's observation proved crucial. Britannicus, breathing heavily, began favoring his right side, just as Marcus had predicted. His thrusts came a fraction slower from that angle, his footwork slightly less certain. Titus, who had been watching for this, began to exploit it ruthlessly, constantly circling to force Britannicus to pivot on his weaker side. Yes, Marcus whispered from his viewing position, his fists clenched. Now, Titus. Now. As if hearing his friend's voice, Titus suddenly changed tactics. Instead of waiting for Britannicus to attack, he charged forward with a roar that echoed through the Colosseum. Britannicus, caught off guard by the sudden aggression, cast his net desperately. This time the net found its mark, entangling Titus's shield arm. Britannicus yanked hard, pulling Titus off balance, and thrust with his trident. The crowd screamed as the three prongs drove toward Titus's exposed chest. But Titus had anticipated this too. He released his shield entirely, letting the net and shield fly away, and twisted his body. The trident scraped across his armor, instead of penetrating, and in that moment of Britannicus's overextension, Titus struck. His gladius found the gap in Britannicus's armor, at the armpit, driving deep. Britannicus screamed, dropping his trident, and fell to his knees. Titus stood over him, sword raised for the killing blow. The crowd was on its feet, but instead of the usual cries for death or mercy, there was near silence. Everyone looked to the imperial box, where Nero sat frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. "The choice is yours, Caesar," Titus called out, following protocol, even though everyone knew what Nero's decision would be. Nero stood slowly, his face purpling with rage. He raised his hand, thumb extended horizontally, the traditional moment of decision. The crowd held its breath, but before Nero could turn his thumb up or down, Britannicus spoke, his voice carrying despite his wound. "Caesar," he gasped, I yield to the better man." Gasps echoed through the Colosseum. A gladiator yielding without imperial permission was almost unheard of, especially one of Britannicus's reputation. "I forbid it," Nero screamed. "You fight to the death." That was the agreement. "Then I choose death," Britannicus said, looking up at Titus. "But know this, Caesar, I die not as your champion, but as a Roman who recognizes honor when he sees it. These two," he gestured weakly toward where Marcus and Livia watched. "They showed more courage tied to that chariot than you have shown in your entire reign. Kill him," Nero commanded Titus. "Kill him now." Titus looked down at Britannicus, then at the crowd, then at Nero. He lowered his sword. "No." "What?" "I said no. The man has yielded. He has shown honor. I will not execute him for speaking truth." The crowd erupted, not in anger, but in approval. "Honor, honor," they chanted, the word becoming a weapon itself, aimed at Nero's legitimacy. "Guards!" Nero screamed. "Arrest them all. The Thracian, Britannicus, Marcus, the girl, all of them." But something unprecedented happened. The Praetorian guards didn't move. They stood at their posts, hands on their weapons, but they did not advance into the arena. "I gave you an order," Nero shrieked at the Praetorian prefect. Chagalinus, who had served Nero faithfully for years, looked at his emperor, then at the crowd, then at the gladiators in the sand. "Your Excellency," he said slowly, "perhaps we should consider the situation." "Traitor!" Nero screamed. "You're all traitors." It was Senator Cassius who stood next, his voice carrying the authority of the Senate. "Citizens of Rome, the trial by combat has been completed. By ancient law, Marcus and Livia are free." The crowd's roar was deafening. People began pouring over the barriers and into the arena itself, not to attack, but to celebrate. They lifted Titus on their shoulders. They helped Britannicus to the medical chambers, treating him now as a hero rather than an enemy. Marcus and Livia found each other in the chaos, embracing despite the pain it caused their still healing bodies. "It's over," Livia whispered against his chest. "No," Marcus replied, looking up at the imperial box where Nero stood abandoned, even his guards having stepped away from him. "I fear it's just beginning." He was right. Over the next hours, as the sun began to set over Rome, extraordinary events unfolded. The Senate, emboldened by the day's events, convened an emergency session. Senators, who had cowered before Nero for years, suddenly found their voices. "The emperor has lost the mandate of heaven," Senator Cassius declared. "The gods themselves have shown their displeasure through the trial by combat." "He is mad," another senator added. "He burns Rome for his pleasure, murders innocents for entertainment, and now even his own champions turn against him." By nightfall, the Senate had done something not done for 100 years. They had declared the emperor an enemy of the state. Nero, abandoned in his palace with only a handful of loyal servants, raged and wept by turns. "They loved me once," he kept saying. "They cheered for me. How dare they turn against their god?" Statilia found him thus, broken and pathetic, all his power evaporated like morning dew. "They never loved you," she said quietly. "They feared you. There's a difference." "You too," he snarled. "My own wife." "I was never your wife," she replied, removing her imperial ring and setting it on a table. "I was your prisoner, but no more." She walked out, leaving Nero truly alone, for perhaps the first time in his life. In the Gladiator barracks, a different scene was playing out. Britannicus, his wound bandaged but not fatal, sat with Marcus and Titus, sharing wine like old friends, rather than recent enemies. "Why?" Marcus asked him. "Why did you yield? Why speak against Nero?" Britannicus was quiet for a long moment. "I've killed 93 men in the arena," he finally said. "I told myself it was for glory, for Rome, for the emperor. But watching you two behind that chariot, refusing to break, refusing to beg, I realized I've been the one who was broken all along. Broken by a system that turns men into beasts, for entertainment." "You could have killed me," Titus said. "That net catch was perfect." "I could have," Britannicus agreed. "But then what? Another victory for a cause I no longer believed in. No, better to lose with honor than win with shame." At the temple of Asclepius, Livia was treating the wounded from the day's chaos, for despite the relatively peaceful revolution, there had been injuries in the crush of crowds and the few scuffles with loyalist guards. As she worked, she felt a presence and turned to find the oracle, Pythia, standing in the doorway. "You came back," Livia said. "I never left," Pythia replied, and her voice was different now, younger, clearer. She removed her hood, revealing herself to be a woman perhaps 30 years old, her eyes brown and very much capable of sight. "You're not blind, no, but sometimes people need to believe in mystic signs more than human courage. Your defiance was the spark, but Rome needed to believe the gods supported it. So it was all a performance." "The blindness, yes. The prophecy," she smiled mysteriously. "Well, the full moon hasn't risen yet." Before Livia could ask what she meant, Pythia had vanished into the crowd of patients and helpers, leaving only questions behind. As the moon rose, not quite full, but nearly so. Marcus found Livia on the temple's roof garden, where she had gone for a moment of peace. The city sprawled below them, torches and lamps creating rivers of light in the darkness. "How's your back?" she asked, as he carefully sat beside her. "Scarred forever, but healing. Your side?" "The same. We'll make quite a pair, the gladiator and the healer, both bearing marks of Nero's justice." "Former gladiator," Marcus corrected. "The Senate has granted manumission to all gladiators who stood against Nero today." "I'm free, Livia. Truly free." She took his hand, their fingers intertwining. "What will you do with your freedom? I told you once about my dream. A small farm, somewhere quiet." "That sounds peaceful." "It does." He paused, then added, "It would be more peaceful with a healer to tend the inevitable injuries that come with farming." Livia smiled. "Are you asking me to marry you, Marcus?" "I'm asking you to be free with me. Marriage, partnership, whatever you choose to call it. But together, my brother would be welcome too. The boy needs proper schooling, and there's a good academy in Tusculum near where I'm thinking of buying land." Livia was quiet for a moment, looking out over Rome. "This city has been my whole life. Everything I know is here." "I know, but perhaps," she continued, "it's time for a new life, one where we're not defined by what we survived, but by what we choose to build." "Is that a yes?" Instead of answering with words, she kissed him, there under the nearly full moon, while Rome celebrated its freedom below. But even in that moment of joy, neither could quite shake the feeling that their story wasn't over. Nero still lived, somewhere in the city, and wounded animals were always most dangerous when cornered. 3 days had passed since the trial by combat, and Rome was a city transformed. The Senate had assumed temporary control, guards searched for Nero throughout the city, and citizens walked the streets with a lightness that hadn't been seen in years. But in a small villa on the outskirts of Rome, Marcus and Livia knew the peace was deceptive. "He's still out there," Marcus said, standing by the window as dawn broke. His back, though healing, still pained him when he moved too quickly. Livia looked up from where she was preparing medicines. The Senate had asked her to help treat those injured during the chaos of the transition, and she had agreed, but only from this safe house that Senator Cassius had provided. "The Senate will find him," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Men like Nero don't simply disappear. He'll want—" His words were cut off by a commotion outside. Quintus burst through the door, his young face flushed with running. "Sister, Marcus, you need to hear this. A messenger just arrived at the Senate. Nero, he's taken hostages." The blood drained from Livia's face. "Who?" "Children. 12 children from noble families who opposed him. He's barricaded himself in the old temple of Venus Genetrix. He says—" Quintus paused, catching his breath. "He says he'll kill 1 child every hour until you and Marcus present yourselves to him." The room fell silent. Outside, birds sang, oblivious to the human drama unfolding. "We have to go," Livia said immediately. "It's a trap," Marcus countered. "He wants revenge. Of course it's a trap, but we can't let children die for us." "The Senate is mobilizing the urban cohorts," Quintus said. "They plan to storm the temple, and Nero will kill all the children the moment he sees them coming," Marcus said grimly. He had seen enough of Nero's madness to know the emperor was capable of anything now. Livia was already gathering her medical supplies. "Then we go. We face him." "Livia, no, Marcus. This started with my refusal. Those children are in danger because of our defiance. I won't have their blood on my hands." Marcus watched her for a long moment, seeing again the courage that had first drawn him to her. "Then we go together, as we've done everything else." Within an hour, they stood before the Temple of Venus Genetrix. It was an ancient building, predating the empire, its stones holding the memories of a Rome that valued honor above power. Now it had become a fortress of madness. The urban cohorts surrounded the building, but at a distance, unwilling to provoke Nero into harming the children. Senator Cassius met them at the perimeter. "You don't have to do this," he said. We can find another way. There is no other way, Livia replied. You know it as well as we do. From within the temple, Nero's voice rang out, distorted but recognizable. I see my guests have arrived. Come in, let's finish our little drama. Marcus and Livia walked forward, hand in hand. At the temple entrance, they were met by two of Nero's last loyal guards, men so deep in his crimes that they had no choice but to follow him to the end. Your weapons, one demanded. Marcus unbuckled his sword, setting it down. Livia placed her small knife beside it. They entered the temple unarmed. The scene inside was worse than they had imagined. The 12 children, the oldest perhaps 10 years old, were tied in a circle around the altar. Their faces were streaked with tears, but they were trying to be brave, little Romans facing their fear with what dignity they could muster. Nero stood at the altar itself, and the sight of him was shocking. In just 3 days, he had deteriorated dramatically. His purple robes were stained and torn, his hair wild, his eyes blazing with the full flower of madness. In his hand he held a ceremonial dagger. The lovers arrive, he announced theatrically. The defiant ones, tell me, was it worth it? Was your precious dignity worth the lives of these children? Let them go, Nero, Marcus said steadily. Your quarrel is with us. My quarrel, Nero laughed, the sound echoing off the ancient stones. My quarrel is with Rome itself. With a world that dares to reject divinity. I am a god, and gods demand sacrifice. You're not a god, Livia said quietly. You're a frightened man who confused fear for respect, power for strength. Nero's face contorted with rage. How dare you? I dare because it's the truth. And deep down you know it. That's why you're here, hiding in a temple with children as shields. Would Jupiter need such protection? Would Mars? For a moment, Nero seemed to deflate, the dagger lowering slightly. But then his madness reasserted itself. Enough talk. Kneel, both of you, kneel before your emperor and beg forgiveness. Beg, and perhaps I'll spare some of these whelps. Marcus and Livia exchanged a look. Without hesitation, they knelt, not for Nero, but for the children watching with terrified eyes. We kneel, Marcus said. Now release them. Not enough, Nero shrieked. Beg, crawl, denounce your defiance. Please, Livia said, and her voice was steady, dignified even in supplication. Please, Nero, show mercy to the innocent. Mercy. Nero stepped down from the altar, approaching them with the dagger. Like the mercy you showed me when you refused my proposal? Like the mercy the crowd showed when they stopped my justice? He raised the dagger, and both Marcus and Livia knew this was the moment. He would kill them here, in front of the children, a final act of cruelty before his inevitable end. But then something unexpected happened. One of the children, a girl of perhaps 8 years, began to sing. It was a simple song, a hymn to Minerva that children learned in their earliest years. Her voice was thin, frightened, but pure. Another child joined her, then another. Within moments, all 12 were singing, their voices creating a chorus that seemed to fill the temple with something Nero could never understand. Innocence. Nero spun toward them, dagger raised. Silence. I command silence. It was the distraction Marcus needed. He lunged forward, not for Nero, but for the nearest child, pulling her free from her bonds with desperate strength. Livia moved at the same instant, grabbing another child. Run, Marcus shouted. All of you, run. Chaos erupted. Nero screamed in rage, slashing wildly with his dagger. The children, some freed by Marcus and Livia, others breaking their own bonds in the confusion, scattered like birds. The guards at the door, faced with the choice of stopping fleeing children or protecting their emperor, chose neither, stepping aside in a moment of human decency. In the melee, Nero's dagger found its mark, not in a child, not in Marcus, but in Livia, who had thrown herself between the blade and a boy too frozen with fear to run. The blade entered just below her ribs, and she gasped, falling to her knees. Time seemed to stop. Livia. Marcus caught her as she fell, his hands immediately going to the wound. Blood seeped between his fingers. Nero stood frozen, the dagger falling from his hand. For a moment, his madness cleared, and he saw what he had done. The woman he had claimed to want as a wife lay bleeding on the temple floor. I didn't mean, he started, but then the sound of soldiers filled the temple. The urban cohorts, seeing the children flee, had stormed in. What happened next would be debated by historians. Some say Nero tried to run and was cut down, others that he fell on his own sword. But Marcus and Livia saw none of it. Their world had shrunk to just the two of them and the spreading pool of blood. "Stay with me," Marcus pleaded, pressing desperately against the wound. "Help! We need help." Physicians rushed in. Senator Cassius had ensured they were standing by. They worked frantically, but the wound was deep, and Livia had already lost so much blood. "Marcus," she whispered, her hand finding his face. "The children, safe, all safe. You saved them." She smiled, though her lips were growing pale. "Then it was worth it. Don't talk like that. You're going to be fine. You're the healer, remember? You don't get to die. Even healers," she coughed, blood speckling her lips. "Even healers have their time." No, I won't accept that. We were going to have that farm, remember? The quiet life. You'll still have it," she said, her voice growing weaker. "Promise me, live the life we dreamed of. Be happy. Not without you." "Marcus," her eyes were starting to unfocus. "Do you remember what you told Quintus about courage? That it's about choosing what's worth living or dying for. I chose. Every time I would choose the same. To stand, to fight, to love you. Livia, please, take care of Quintus. He needs. Her words trailed off. Her hand fell from his face. The temple fell silent, except for Marcus's broken sobbing. But then, just as all hope seemed lost, Pythia appeared. Not the false oracle, but moving with purpose and authority that made even the soldiers step back. "Move aside," she commanded, kneeling beside Livia. From her robes, she pulled a vial similar to the phoenix tears, but this one glowed with an inner light. "What is that?" Marcus demanded. "Something that should not exist. Something saved for a moment when the gods themselves weep for injustice." She poured the liquid directly onto Livia's wound, then forced the rest between her lips. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Livia gasped, her back arching. The wound began to close, impossibly, miraculously. Color returned to her cheeks. "This is not without price," Pythia said to Marcus. "She will live, but she will carry the mark of divine intervention forever. She can never bear children. She will feel the echo of this wound every day of her life. Do you understand?" "I understand," Marcus said immediately. "She's alive. That's all that matters." Livia's eyes opened, confused but clear. "Marcus? What, the children? Safe. You saved them all. And Nero? Dead," Senator Cassius said, approaching, by his own hand. In the end, he couldn't face what he had become. Livia tried to sit up, wincing at the pain that, true to Pythia's words, still echoed through her body. "Then it's over?" "It's over," Marcus confirmed, helping her stand. But as they emerged from the temple, supported by Marcus and surrounded by cheering crowds who had heard of their survival, Livia knew it wasn't really over. It was, instead, a beginning. The farm in Tusculum was everything Marcus had dreamed of and more. Olive trees lined the hillside, their silver leaves rustling in the afternoon breeze. A vegetable garden, tended with the same care Livia had once shown her patience, flourished near the house. Marcus stood in the doorway, watching Livia teach a group of local children about medicinal herbs. She couldn't have children of her own, the price of divine intervention. but she had become mother to dozens of local orphans and abandoned children who came to learn healing from the famous woman who had defied an emperor. Quintus, now 17 and studying at the academy, visited off. He was writing a history of Nero's fall, ensuring that the truth would be remembered. "Someone needs to record it properly," he said, "so future generations understand that tyrants fall not through grand battles, but through simple acts of courage." Titus the Thracian had bought the neighboring farm with his gladiator winnings. He and Marcus worked the fields together, brothers in peace as they had been in war. Even Britannicus visited occasionally, having become a trainer at a new type of ludus, one that taught combat as art and discipline rather than bloody spectacle. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, the children dispersed to their homes. Livia walked to Marcus, moving carefully. Her wound still pained her, would always pain her, a reminder of the price of defiance. "Any regrets?" Marcus asked, as he did sometimes, pulling her close. "How could I regret the path that brought us here?" she replied. "Every scar, every pain, every moment of fear, they were all steps on the road to this peace. Even knowing you can't have children," Livia gestured to the departing children, then to the house where 3 orphans they had formerly adopted were helping prepare dinner. "I have children, perhaps not born of my body, but mine nonetheless. The gods took one gift but gave me another." A rider approached on the road, bearing the insignia of the Senate. Marcus tensed. Even after 5 years, official messages made him wary, but the messenger simply handed over a scroll and departed without waiting for a reply. Livia opened it, read, and laughed. "The Senate wants to erect a statue of us at the Circus Maximus, where we were tied to the chariot." "Tell them no," Marcus said immediately. "I intend to, but listen to what Cassius writes at the end. Rome needs its heroes to be human, not marble. Live your lives well, and that will be monument enough." As darkness fell, they stood together, looking out over their land. In the distance, Rome's lights twinkled like earthbound stars. The city continued, as it always had, a mixture of greatness and corruption, nobility and cruelty. But here in this small corner of the world, 2 people who had defied an emperor had found something more valuable than power or fame. They had found peace, purpose, and each other. "Do you think they'll remember us?" Livia asked. "In 100 years, 1,000, will anyone know our names?" "Does it matter?" Marcus replied. "We didn't stand against Nero for fame or history. We did it because it was right. And if we had to do it again..." Marcus turned to her, seeing in her eyes the same strength that had first captivated him, the same courage that had changed the course of an empire. "Then we would stand again, together, always together." As they walked back to their house where warmth and family waited, a figure watched from the hillside. Pythia, or whatever her true name was, smiled sadly. She had told them the price of divine intervention, but not the full truth. Livia would live far longer than any normal person, would see Marcus age and die while she remained relatively young. It was the God's way. Every miracle had its shadow. But watching them now, seeing the love that had survived everything Nero could inflict, she thought perhaps they would find a way through that too. Love that could defy an emperor could surely defy time itself. The full moon rose over Tusculum, the same moon that had witnessed their ordeal, now blessing their peace. And somewhere in the beyond, where the souls of tyrants and heroes alike must answer for their choices, perhaps even Nero finally understood the truth, that power taken by force is always weaker than courage freely given. In years to come, when bards sang of Marcus and Livia, they would always end with the same verse: "They stood when standing meant their doom. They bled when bleeding seemed in vain. They loved when love defied the tomb, and proved that courage breaks all chains." But for now, in this moment, they were simply Marcus and Livia, survivors who had chosen to become something more. And in that choice, in that simple farm in Tusculum, the true glory of Rome lived on, not in conquest or spectacle, but in the quiet dignity of lives well lived, love well given, and freedom well earned. The emperor who had thought himself a god was forgotten within a generation, his statues torn down, his name became synonymous with madness and cruelty. But the gladiator and the healer who had defied him, their story spread like seeds on the wind, taking root in hearts across the empire, reminding all who heard it that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can topple the mightiest of thrones. And in the end, isn't that the most human truth of all? That love is stronger than fear, that dignity cannot be taken, only surrendered, and that two people standing together can change the world simply by refusing to kneel to injustice. As the lamp lights in their home were extinguished one by one, as the children settled into sleep, as Marcus and Livia held each other in the darkness, the world turned on. But it turned differently because they had lived, loved, and stood. And that, perhaps, is immortality enough.